The Feudal Future Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And, Joel, our podcast is all about unintended consequences. And today, we are going to tackle some really interesting nuances around that topic when it comes to populism. And to help us do that, we've got two wonderful guests. Bill Binning, who is a professor emeritus at Youngstown State University in Ohio and a political scientist. And our old friend, Michael Lind, who is a writer and historian, a teacher at University of Texas, and a contributor to Tablet magazine. His newest book, Hell to Pay, How the Suppression of Wages is Destroying America, is just out. And gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Joel, why don't you kick us off and ask about the state of populism and where things are going?
Yeah, and maybe populism, particularly, Bill, in your state. Historically, we've thought of Midwestern populism as being predominantly a left-wing phenomena. In recent years, it seems to have shifted a bit. What do you think is happening? Do you think populism is bifurcating in a place like Ohio, or is one tradition overcoming the other?
I would say that a lot of it's at this point. What's most noticeable is it's on the I guess you'd say the right. I mean, let me give you this experience that. We had James Traficant as a congressman for quite a few years, and he was he was a Democrat, but he was quite populist in his speeches, in his style, and I'm not certain that he didn't sort of set. And in Mahoning Valley, of course, one of the parts of Ohio that has shifted, it's realigned. It's become much more Republican and. Been voting Republican and likely going to be carried by Trump, and I think that had the groundwork for that was laid by the populist message of James Traficant, and then a lot of the same themes, a little different, a lot of the same themes picked up by Trump and the MAGA message. So, I mean, that's my contribution. I don't really know. We've had a lot of populism coming from the Democratic Party of late in Ohio. But that guy was mentioning before, I thought there was a lot. I thought that the National Democratic Party certainly trying to pick that theme up in their convention.
Well, that opens up the question really of the history of populism. Mike, maybe you can give us a little history lesson here about how far back populism goes as a theme in American presidential politics or even regional politics.
Well, populism in American history is associated with tribunes of outsiders, politicians like Jackson or Williams Jennings Bryan or Huey Long in Louisiana during the Depression, or Traficant, or others, including Trump, who at least they claim to be representing disfranchised groups that are not represented in the political system. And historically, there can be two outcomes to that. The populism, this outsider anti-establishment politics, can be ephemeral because one of the two parties, or both of the two parties we have in our system, with our electoral system, we tend to have two major parties, incorporates the concerns of that group, and then they cease to be outsiders. They become a faction, they become an interest, they become a lobby within a functioning two-party system. There are other cases where you don't have a functioning democratic system. That was true of the American South for most of the period between Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Revolution. And so the populism there, it never resulted in the incorporation of the concerns of the people that the populists claim to lead. Often they betrayed them, but they claim to lead them. In much of the South, you had a one-party oligarchic regime. run by the Democratic Party, the Southern Democrats, the Bourbon Democrats. They policed the mail. They suppressed dissent. They threw away Republican votes. I mean, it was a quasi-dictatorship as well as being an authoritarian state. I say this as a fifth-generation Texan. And as a result, instead of having so for example, the William Jennings Bryan agrarian populist concerns were ultimately addressed successfully by the progressives and by the New Dealers. So you get, the farm subsidies, you get for small banks, you get the FDIC. That was an 1890s populist thing. But it becomes incorporated into the political system.
So is this a typical response, is that you have a disenfranchised large group of people that have an agenda, and then while they put candidates out that may be kind of fringy, but ultimately they're subsumed by their agenda gets subsumed by one of the mainstream parties? Is that kind of the typical pattern?
Well, it's one pattern, and that was what happened with agrarian populism in the North and East and the Midwest. So, for example, Woodrow Wilson refused to vote for Bryan. Wilson was a Democrat, but at least one of the times Bryan ran, he voted for the third-party candidate. FDR was for McKinley against Bryan. I think he was too young to vote in 1896. But of course, Bryan eventually became Secretary of State for Wilson, resigned in protest over World War I. But as I said, even though they detested Bryan and Bryanism, Woodrow Wilson and FDR had this kind of elitist incorporation of the conservatives and the policies of the populists. But in contrast, I think you have this Southern pattern where you just have this oligarchy in the South that was at the state and local level, and they don't respond, right? They either co-opt the populists by buying them off, or the populists betray their followers and create their own corrupt political machines, like the Long Machine in Louisiana. And you don't get the incorporation of these alienated voters.
So let me ask this of both Bill and you. It seems to me that if you were to look at who feels disenfranchised today and is represented in the Trumpian populist movement, it is people who are involved in manufacturing jobs, middle-class people, working-class people in manufacturing jobs, or trades.
And particularly small business owners. I think that's really...
Yeah, okay. And let's add that in, because now we're talking about non-industrial, oligarchic people. So is that particularly manifested in your area? Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, let me give some context, limited context to that manufacturing is certainly the case. That in the case of the Youngstown, Ohio, and probably many Midwestern deindustrialized areas, the current population feels aggrieved because their parents or their grandparents did much. They felt, or they feel, they did much better. They had industrial jobs in steel or in auto, and they made at that time good wages. They were unions, and they could buy a boat, and mama could stay home, and life was good. And now, if you go to the child or the grandchild, those opportunities are not there anymore. They're going to work maybe 2 jobs. They're going to work, you don't get very good benefits. Their pay's not very good. And so when you get somebody with, Traficant was the voice for that. But we just say that's what Trump picks up in the Mahoning Valley, and what we've seen from that is that he's sort of redefined what the Republican Party is, at least in that part of Ohio. And now we could predict. Predicting election is dangerous business, but we can predict that he's going to do. That is, Trump's going to do very well in Mahoning Valley and that all along the eastern border. But that's the grievance. The grievance is these males who feel that somebody screwed them, and they're mad, and that people like Trump give voice to this grievances
Well, can I take issue with that? It's not just angry white men. White
Yes.
married women vote just like their husbands do. In fact, the only Democratic presidents since World War II who have received a majority of the white married female vote were Lyndon Johnson and Bill Clinton in 1992. So the gender gap is really kind of a myth. It exists statistically, but if you factor out particular groups, it vanishes. So, for example, African American women have extremely high rates of being single,
Right.
and they also have extremely high rates of being Democratic because they're African American. Single women tend to be very Democratic. So I just want to push back on this angry white man thing. It's actually families.
Well, I'll make the point that it's the men who were working in the. I'm not taking into account the whole female. It is the males, historically, who had the jobs in the
Well, it's
mills.
one
Women
or
were now
families.
working in the steel industry or the auto industry in the
Right.
50s, and it's not, and they may share the grievance of their spouse, but it's the male then. Well, and it also goes to the role of the male in the household, because they were the big breadwinners, and now that's been, in many cases, their spouse, their wife is a better breadwinner than the male. That just rubs salt in the wounds.
But this
So
is
it's
not
the
popular.
it's the family dynamic here
Yeah,
that
right,
you're
right.
both pointing out, actually,
Yeah,
which I
you're
find
right.
interesting. Given if you look at, we're deep as we're recording this, we're deep into the political campaign season,
Right.
and J.D. Vance, who's the
I was
Republican,
going to bring up JD. Obviously JD, Bill from Ohio
yes,
politics,
Yes,
and both Mike and I know him personally. So
he's all about the family.
yeah. Is he successfully synthesizing the family and the class issue, or is he a failure? Because obviously mainstream media has very little positive to say about him.
Well, I think he's making an effort, and of course, I think he's having a hard time. One, developing his message, and two, he can't break through the legacy media with any kind of message because they take up sound bites from 10 years ago and make that his message. So I think he's been trying to do that. I'm not certain he's been very successful yet in delivering his message, because he's getting distracted by all of these, by the cat lady and by all these other
Well, but there
things
is.
that the legacy media picks up from things they didn't even say during his campaign. So I don't know that he's breaking through. I think he thinks that way, but I don't think he's breaking through.
Mike,
I think there's basically a three-way division when it comes to the family, because the corporate Republicans, the libertarian Republicans, want all mothers of young children in the workforce from immediately after birth. Maybe they'll give them like 6 weeks of paid leave. So the Chamber of Commerce Republicans are in favor of daycare outside the home, because the basic model for growth shared by the conventional Republicans and Democrats now is no longer industrial, technological productivity growth. They have no idea how to bring that about. They simply want to expand the workforce. So both the business Republicans and the Democrats, who are now the party of the affluent in business, mostly the elite businesses and professionals, through immigration, you expand the workforce. Through providing daycare so that all mothers of young children immediately go back to work, you expand the workforce, and then that means more spending, more consumption, and et cetera. So there's a faction of moderate social conservatives that J.D. Vance is associated with, Warren Cass and American Compass and so on, which responds to what a substantial number of American women, a majority of American women say, that given the choice, they would rather stay at home when their children are young or work only part-time. Only a minority of American women want to work full-time while they have young children. And that minority is mostly college-educated professionals who belong to what I call the three-parent family. It's the working father, the working mother, and the nanny who is paid to take care of the kids so that both parents can work. And the Democrats, somewhat to my surprise, I grew up as a Democrat, are utterly hostile to homemakers now. For example, I was talking to Democrats on the Hill over the last few years. They absolutely oppose giving subsidies to homemakers to match subsidies for daycare. Okay, so for example, the Democrats have proposed universal preschool, universal daycare outside the home. Well, Germany and Canada and various other countries give parents money, and they can spend it either on institutional daycare or to support a stay-at-home caregiver, usually the mother, but maybe a grandmother or the father or something. Not a single Democrat, to my knowledge, supports
That's very interesting.
Parents to have a choice.
That's very interesting, which kind of goes along with homeschooling as well, if you look at the similar breakdown. But, so I'm hearing from you guys a theme here that the pivot for populism at the moment, one pivot is the changing nature of the family. Let me ask whether there are other pivots out there potentially. So, for instance, the notion of the expanding public debt and the deficit kind of reminds me of the William Jennings Bryan era cross of gold. Let's make sure we're on the gold standard. Let's not bankrupt the country kind of conversation around the turn of the 20th century. Is that also a pivot, or is that something you think is just not involved in the populist debate at all?
No, only elites care about the deficit. It's an excuse to cut government spending, by which they mean programs on the working class and the middle class, not raising taxes on themselves. We see, by the way, I think the potential betrayal of both populists and progressives by Republicans like Trump and by Democrats like Schumer going after these crypto billionaires. Because the crypto thing is a scam, right? I mean, we're not going to replace government fiat money with these, crypto coins where you have to generate vast amounts of electricity to data mine, to test. So basically, this is a pump and dump scheme that these Silicon Valley investors, want to get rich from. And both parties now are chasing their money. And it reminds me of, this is a really obscure part of American history. A lot of the original populists in the 19th century, and remember, William Jennings Bryan was kind of an opportunist. He kind of glommed onto this movement that already existed. It had started, with people.
It was the Bitcoin of his time.
Yeah, we know with the silver thing, a lot of the original agrarian populists claimed that Bryan sold the populist movement out to the silver mining interests, right? But now maybe Trump will sell out the right-wing populists to the Bitcoin miners.
I think that that what we have in the current political climate, or the two major parties and their nominees and their platforms, is that there's no interest in the issue of the debt or the deficit. Typically that was the older Republican Party. I don't know, Michael calls them the party of the Bushes, etc. That was one of their. Remember, Bush made. I was thinking about this the other day. Bush the first made a commitment. Read my lips, dog. No new taxes, and then he broke that because they felt taxes were necessary to deal with the budget issue. We never hear anything from any of these candidates about the budget issue or the deficit. We just keep rolling along in bigger debts, and nobody talks about funding Social Security or funding Medicare or what we're going to do about any of these fiscal issues. That's ignored by both parties. So I don't know that it's a turning point. We just dropped it. I mean, that's the old Republican Party, and I don't know that it'll come back if Trump's movement fails. I mean, you could argue that the Trump movement has taken over the Republican Party, at least, or occupied it at least temporarily. And if he doesn't win, are the old Republicans, the elites, the country club crowd, and as Michael said, the chamber crowd, they're going to come back, and then because that's their issue, the old, balance the budget, and cut spending or raise taxes or do something. It's dangerous to have this big debt, but you don't hear that from political elites who are seeking office.
I agree with that, although there's one little asterisk. When she ran in 2016, Hillary Clinton promised that no taxes would go up on any household making less than $200,000 a year. They were middle class, right?
Right.
Now, as this basically the professional upper middle class among at least white Americans is now one of the bases of the Democratic Party. So by 2020, Joe Biden promised that no household making less than $400,000 a year would have their taxes go up. I think the Democratic platform makes the same number. It's $400,000. So on the Democratic side, you can't raise taxes on the people you would have to raise taxes on if you're going to solve the deficit through taxes.
Right.
Trump, to his credit, in my view, one of his few principles is he doesn't want to cut Social Security or Medicare. This is just unpopular with his followers, right? Why, so I do think, I agree. I think that this issue, it will be pushed in the prestige press in the business community, but I think politically it's a non-starter in either party.
Well, one of the things
certainly it is now. Yeah. And the question is, will it come back? We don't know. Right now, nobody's talking. There's no Bush the first out there.
Or Pete Peterson.
But what I also wonder about is when we talk about who this populist movement is, populism has a very mixed history with issues of race. But one of the more surprising things, at least until the Harris coup took place, was that the Democrats were losing Hispanics, even some African Americans, some Asian voters. How is populism? It seems to me populism and race are sort of a very unstable combination. What do you see going out there?
Well, what I see is racial de-alignment in politics, by and large, and educational alignment. And this has been going on for some time. That is, the diploma divide within all racial ethnic categories, even African Americans, who are the most partisan Democrats, is increasing. So non-college educated Hispanics and Asian Americans are much more likely to be Republican, like non-college educated whites. And the reverse is also true. That is, college educated Hispanics and Asians are more likely to be Democrats. Now, this cannot last in a two-party system because working class people are the majority in every democracy, including our own in Western Europe and so on. So the only reason you have two parties is that the working class is divided by other issues. And arguably, race has been the most important issue from the civil rights issue up in era until recently. But so if the salience of race is declining, and on both sides, right, not just among whites becoming less racist, but also among non-whites becoming less afraid that the Ku Klux Klan is going to come back, that they're going to go back to segregation, so on. There've got to be other issues, and I suspect the issues are going to be these kind of family and value issues. They're not necessarily religious right type issues, but the differences in the lifestyle preferences among working class families and highly educated professional class families.
And of course, you have issues. I
think Mike was right on that point. I think we see that, and we've seen that in this cycle of the election. Race has not been very salient in some of the groups that he mentioned have been breaking away from the Democratic Party. They were held by old racial themes, but now they were breaking away. Whether that there's a temporary hold on that with the Harris candidacy, we'll have to see.
Well, Mike, I just want to drill down a little bit further on your point. What aspect of of this divide are you really referring to? Is it having children versus not having children? Our lifestyle choices. What are these? You think the pivot points?
I think it's paid care. Let me explain. In the New York Times had a great statistic a few years ago. It's still valid, I'm sure. The average American, they looked at women because women live longer than men in the U.S. The average American lives within like 18 miles of her mother. Okay? So ever since then, I've been going to college-educated audiences and saying, how many of you live within 18 miles of your mother? Well, of course not, because if you go to college, your career tends to define your identity, and you go, and this is what I did. I left Texas for Washington and New York for 30 years. That's where I did my business in politics and journalism. I would have gone to Branson if I were a country music singer, right? So college-educated professionals, the elite, tend to put career above locality and neighborhood and family. If you're most working class people, now there's some working class people with specialized jobs, like if you're a roustabout on an oil rig or something like that, you have to go to North Dakota. But if you're a janitor or a security guard or a clerk at the grocery store or a nursing aide, you can do that anywhere in the United States. And so many of them just do it in the cities where they grow up. If you look at, periodically there's some story about how astonishing it is. Enormous numbers of Americans not only live in the state in which they were born, but they live in the city in which they were born, which is true of me, but I'm very rare for someone with my education. And so I don't think this whole caregiving thing is going to become a big axis, not necessarily populism, but will divide the parties, because the Democrats now are the party predominantly of professionals. And their ideal is the two-earner family. Well, that means you have to have someone take care of the kids if you have kids, and you live 1,000 miles away from your mother and your grandmother and your aunt and your uncle and so on. And so who's going to look after them? Either you pay them, it's a paid caregiver out of your own pocket, or it's universal daycare of some kind. And the same is true of multi-generational families. Traditional working class families are more comfortable, maybe because they didn't have an alternative, with having, the widowed grandmother move in with them than I think the upper middle class couple is, right? Would rather have them stay in a separate home as long as possible.
So are you projecting that we'll see pushback from people who are living in the same area that they grew up in, have family, have that infrastructure, against subsidizing that extra care?
Yeah, I think so, because it's a problem of coastal big city professionals more than it is of working class people in medium and small towns, because they have these local family networks to look after the kids, even if both parents are working.
Mm-hmm. Bill, how does that ring to you in Ohio?
Well, and it's certainly true. Of course, Ohio is not one place, but certainly what Michael talks about is the case in Youngstown, that the extraordinary number of the percentage of the population was born there. There are very few people moving there. The people were born there, and they have a lot of networks to families. You go to their, they have big weddings, big other social activities, because they've got all kinds of cousins and second cousins, et cetera, all there. And there's very few people. I mean, I was there because I moved there because I was teaching school. But you're rare, and you looked on as rare, because most people there don't even know people or meet people from someplace else. But you would not find that in Columbus, for example. I mean, that's a very mobile place. But I want to go back to another point on Michael's point, about this family. I mean, one of the issues, and I think Vance is trying to get at it, but one of the things that we're seeing is it's a very low birth rate, and that's occurring to a great extent with the population that Michael's talking about, professional classes, but they're not even getting married anymore. It's a very large percentage of young people. I don't remember what it is statistically, but a very significant proportion of people 30 or 40 are not married anymore. People are not getting married, and I think a lot of those people are in the black class that Michael's characterizing. And if they get married, they don't have any children. And of course, I think that's what Vance was getting at when he was talking about the cattle lady. But that's, of course, he never got his. I don't think he got the message. I don't think that was the message. That's the point of the cattle lady, is that the elites especially they're not getting married, and if they're getting married, many of them are not having children. And of course that goes back to the Social Security problem. You don't have a younger population to work and pay taxes. I just saw it. They just came out with it. I think the birth rate again, the United States birth rate again is down 1 or 2% over last year. So it's a continuing problem, but it's part of this culture that Michael talks about among elites, especially. But even younger people, a lot of them are younger people without college education. They can't see any opportunity for them to get married, to have a house, to have a wife, to have a kid. And the women don't see the males as significant breadwinners where they can create that kind of life. So we're in a strange place.
Well, I guess it's kind of a weird notion that if populism depends on population, and if you don't have any population, you're not going to have populism. Well, so who knows what's going to happen 30 years from now when nobody's around?
Well, one of the really interesting things as we try to figure out where this is going in the long run is Eric Kaufman's book, where he talks about that ultimately the Western countries will have to go further to the right, because the only people having children tend to be conservative and tend to be religious. Right? The religious will inherit the earth. The question is, will things in the interim get so bad that even the religious won't have kids?
Well, I've looked at the data, and it's true that all other things being equal, everyone will be Mormon or Amish in like 500 years. But it takes, that's how long it takes, right? It's not a short-term solution to your shortfall, which there's this overwhelming pressure to use immigrants to plug the gap. But that's kind of a Ponzi scheme for two reasons. First of all, the immigrants themselves get old. So, do you bring in ever-increasing numbers of immigrants to keep
and they have less
ratio?
Children, too, increasingly.
And again, they assimilate, and then they become low fertility like everybody else. But the other thing is, every country in the world, except for like half a dozen, now has below replacement fertility rates, even in the Middle East and in South America and much of Asia.
And Israel is one of the few countries that is reproducing at a sufficient rate.
But otherwise, it's a few sub-Saharan countries and Central Asian countries. And once that dries up, then I think Eric Kaufman's point kicks in. The only population which, without some kind of government, incentive, is having kids will be the very religious sectarians.
So in terms of trying to put this all together, I'd like to ask each of you, what do you think the future of populism is? What will it look like as it evolves? Particularly once we get rid of Trump, one way or the other, and it's almost impossible to have rational discussions with Trump around, because his followers are kind of nutty, and the people who hate him are kind of nutty. So where do you see the future of populism beyond the Trump years? Will it help the right? Will it help the left? Or how will it redefine our politics?
Well, I think we're going to see decades of very bad Deep South type populism rather than good New Deal type response. Because what should have happened if we were going to have a happy ending is that as of 2016, the Democrats should have said, we needlessly alienated all of these working class white Midwestern, people in Youngstown and elsewhere, and we're going to reach out to them and we're going to dial down the left wing, defund the police and the white privilege stuff and all of that. And instead, they doubled down on their cultural leftism and on their, basically defined 40% of the population as fascists, not just Trump. All Republicans are fascists and Nazis trying to overthrow America, according to mainstream Democratic propaganda. So that's not outreach, to the populist masses. With Trump, I think we'll see what happens if he gets reelected. I think it's unlikely at this point, but he strikes me as 90% of the populists in American history, whether they were mayors or governors. We never had a president except maybe for Trump and Andrew Johnson and Jackson. They betrayed their followers. They were just in it for themselves, and then they used their power to pass out favors to their cronies and to create family dynasties in some cases. So, but what that means is, I think I'm worried that we're seeing this kind of situation where you have this unrepentant oligarchy, including many Democrats and Republicans, who think these people are trash. I mean, they're rabble. We're not going to compromise with them, and they're going to become extinct anyway as the country becomes more non-white. So let them die. We hate them. That's the elite. And it's kind of like the Southern ruling class, in the old days. And then we'll just ignore them. And then on the other side, you will get people, some on the left, like Bernie Sanders, but mostly on the right, like Trump. They will pop up every few years, and some of them will have some success, but they will ultimately fail because they're not that serious. There's no movement behind them. And that would be a very disruptive society. It would be post-democratic in many ways.
What do you think?
I'm not so sure. I thought about this a little bit. What would happen with, and it's going to happen anyway, because even if Trump wins, he's going to be a short term, because he's only going to, well, of course, unless he can change the Constitution, he's only going to be there for a short while. And I think that's where Vance comes into play. And I think that's where Vance comes into play, even if they lose, because then you're going to, I think particularly, we'll call it the Republican Party, but let's say the right, you're gonna see people like DeSantis and Vance sort of be competitors, I think, to create a message. It's because they're not going to have personality. Trump relies greatly on his acting ability, his personality. And they're going to have to rely more on themes and ideas. And so I think we're going to see, probably, as you would expect, I think it's going to be an unusual amount of turmoil within the Republican Party if Trump doesn't win. And you're going to see, as Michael talks about, the older class of the elite Republicans try to come back. The Bush crowd will try to come back and grab the reins of the party. So you're going to see it's going to be a lot of fun to watch what happens when Trump disappears. It's going to be, whether it's sooner or later, but I think you're going to see the continuing conflict. There's not going to be agreement within the Republican Party, a consensus as to what they're all about and who their leader's going to be. We see some contenders. Like
creative destruction.
Yeah,
I think is the economic term for what is about to happen here.
Although I'd have to say the Democratic Party.
Those would be my two picks. DeSantis, who's really seems to me, he was really on a lot of the cultural issues, and he just wasn't able to see. I mean, the legacy media wouldn't give him a break, but he couldn't break out of Florida. They made him a book burner and a lot of other things. And the same thing they're doing at Vance. He can't really get his ideas out either. They sort of, like I said, they take these things he said 10 years ago and talk about the cat lady. But those two have new ideas too, that appeal to the working class. in many respects. And I think I don't want to take up any more of the time, but we see that with Vance when it's not necessarily clear to me, but when he talks about his acknowledging unions and the importance of unions, et cetera, is that going to become part of the meat of the Republican Party? Is that going to get questioned again? Is that going to become an anti-union party when this subsides? So there's a lot of uncertainty as to what we're going to see. But I think a lot of the action is going to be in the Republican Party. I don't know the Democratic Party. I think Michael's right. I mean, it's a group of elites, and they pulled a coup, and they're going to try to keep control, and they sort of agree on a lot of things, and they're not really telling us what to do either.
Well, I would describe the Democratic Party as now the soft Stalinist party. I mean, the degree of unanimity, the embrace of censorship, the ability of small groups to just designate people. I mean, as much of I can't stand Trump personally, but at least he did compete in a primary and had to prove something. And I just think that we're going into a period where it's very interesting. There's one last question maybe for Mike. Do you think the Republican Party is where this turmoil over populism is going to take place because the Democratic Party is basically now a done deal?
Yeah, I think it's basically the out party in American history that has an incentive to have debates, right? Because they want to get back in. And the Republicans, even though they go back and forth in the House and the Senate, they haven't won the popular vote in the White House since 1988, right? With the exception of George W. Bush in wartime in 2004. They've lost every major cultural, media, academic institution. I mean, they are the out party. And I think I agree with Professor Benning, there's going to be a huge debate between these different wings and a lot of creative policy thinking and a lot of different strategies. Whereas the Democrats they're the hegemonic party among the American establishment, the way, say, the Republicans were in the McKinley era, right? Where it's just everyone was an Episcopalian Republican, in publishing and business and so on. And they'd have no incentive, especially if they're winning demographically, if they have any debates, that will endanger their majority, right? So it's you kind of have to choose between intellectual creativity among the outsiders, and then once you're inside, then you try to shut down thinking and dissent the debate because you're afraid you'll mess things up.
Well, we are living it. This is the fun part about all of this, is that we're part of living history. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Bill, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Mike, thank you again for coming back. Once again, your new book, which is Hell to Pay, How the Suppression of Wages is Destroying America, is out. And thank you so much for being here, and thank you for being part of the Feudal Future podcast.
And we will like to revisit this maybe after the election to see where we stand on the issue of populism, which I think is one of the more interesting movements in modern American history, and frankly, as well in Europe as well.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The Feudal Future.